Imagine waking up on your wedding night, not to a husband waiting with flowers, but to guards carrying whips, chains, and iron rods. For some women in the Ottoman Empire, marriage began with chains, markets, and contracts written by masters. These weren't fairy tales, they were transactions. And when those unions went wrong, when a slave bride resisted, displeased, or even tried to escape, the punishments waiting for her were so brutal, so methodically crafted, that most of us wouldn't last a single day. The Ottomans ruled for more than 6 centuries, stretching across Europe, Asia, and Africa. Inside this massive empire, slavery wasn't just tolerated, it was institutionalized. Women taken as concubines or brides often had no choice, no voice, and no rights to protect them. And when they defied the order of their new households, the system had punishments designed not only to hurt their bodies, but to break their will. Let's start with the most infamous, the bastinado. Imagine being forced to lie on the ground, your ankles tied together, while strong men lifted your feet into the air, not for relaxation, not for massage. This was torture. A long stick, sometimes a cane, sometimes a heavy rod, would rain down blow after blow on the soles of your feet. At first it might feel like stinging pain, but after dozens of strikes, the skin split, the muscles tore, and walking became impossible. In some cases, slave brides were deliberately beaten until their feet swelled so much they couldn't stand for weeks. It was a punishment chosen not just for pain, but for humiliation. You can't run when you can't walk, and you can't rebel when every step feels like knives stabbing the ground beneath you. But the bastinado was just one flavor of cruelty. In Ottoman law and practice, punishments often matched the crime. Defiance could mean lashes across the back, with rawhide whips, leaving scars that told a permanent story. Attempted escape, that could mean chains tightened around the neck, paraded in front of the household, or even the market where you had once been sold. These punishments weren't only about controlling one woman, they were warnings for all the others who might dare to imagine freedom. And then came the punishments reserved for the palace, because inside the Sultan's harem, yes, the one wrapped in myths of silk curtains and exotic perfumes, slave brides lived under constant scrutiny. Discipline there was swift and often theatrical. A concubine who was accused of betrayal, even whispering with the wrong guard, might find herself facing the dreaded silken cord. This was the Ottoman signature execution method. A bowstring or silk rope slipped around the neck, pulled tight until silence fell. No messy blood, no public spectacle, just a clean erasure of a life deemed inconvenient. Many slave brides who crossed the wrong powerful figure never saw another sunrise. Still, not all punishments were immediate death. Some were designed for long grinding suffering. Take confinement. Imagine being locked for weeks in a small chamber, with no light, no bedding, barely any food. In palaces, such rooms were called the cage, and even princes were thrown into them. For a slave bride, isolation meant erasing her from daily life, stripping her of voice and dignity, until she was willing to submit again. It wasn't just physical, it was social death. And in the Ottoman world, where honor and hierarchy meant everything, being erased could feel worse than a beating. The Ottomans also practiced public shaming. A slave bride accused of theft or dishonor could be dragged through the streets with her face blackened by soot, forced to ride a donkey backwards, and mocked by crowds. Picture it, the same woman who once poured wine at her master's table, now stumbling under laughter and spit. These punishments transformed the victim into a living warning sign. This is what happens if you step out of line. And yet some of the harshest punishments weren't physical at all. They attacked family, love, and motherhood. In the empire, a slave bride's children technically belonged to her master. If she displeased him, her child could be taken away, sold, or given to another household. For a mother, losing her child was a deeper wound than any lash. Ottoman society understood this, and sometimes used it deliberately as leverage. Obedience could mean the difference between keeping your child at your side or watching them vanish into another set of chains. But let's rewind a little. Because to understand these punishments, we need to see how deeply slavery was woven into the empire. The Ottomans relied on the devshirme system, a practice where young Christian boys were taken from their families, converted, and raised as soldiers or administrators. Girls weren't taken in the same organized way, but they were seized through conquest, raids, or slave markets. Many became concubines or brides, their marriages less about love and more about consolidating household power. And once inside, obedience was absolute. Disobedience wasn't treated as a mistake, it was treated as betrayal. The punishments then weren't just discipline, they were performances of control. Every lash, every cord, every public humiliation was a way to remind both the punished and the watching that the hierarchy was unshakable. One of the darker punishments used in both the palace and provincial households was branding. Yes, like livestock, hot irons pressed into skin, leaving permanent marks of shame. In some cases, runaway slaves were branded on the forehead so no one could mistake their status again. Imagine the pain of the scar, but worse, the knowledge that your skin would carry the empire's ownership for the rest of your life. And if branding sounds too extreme, remember, execution was always an option. Slave brides accused of poisoning their masters, or even suspected of conspiracy, were drowned in weighted sacks and thrown into the Bosporus. The water erased their bodies, the silence erased their names. No graves, no remembrance, just disappearance. Yet not every punishment was about blood or fire. Some punishments lived in the rituals of everyday obedience. Slave brides could be forced to serve in degrading ways, scrubbing floors with bare hands while wearing heavy chains, or standing for hours with trays of water until their arms shook uncontrollably. Small, repetitive punishments broke down resistance more effectively than constant torture. It was the grind that crushed the spirit. Still, nothing compares to the punishments reserved for betrayal in the Sultan's household. The harem was a world within a world, lavish, controlled, and dangerous. A favorite concubine who fell out of favor might lose her jewels and silks overnight, stripped back to rags, ordered to serve those who once bowed to her. Status could be ripped away as quickly as breath, and for those accused of serious offenses, the silken cord was waiting. Quick, quiet, merciless. You might be wondering, why silk? Why not a rope or a sword? The Ottomans believed silk was noble, befitting of royal blood. To execute with silk was to kill with elegance, even in brutality. For slave brides, it was a final irony. Their lives ended not with fire or screams, but with silk, the same material they may have once worn in their finest moments. Among the most chilling punishments faced by slave brides was mutilation. In the Ottoman records, there are scattered accounts of women accused of betrayal or escape attempts having ears or noses cut off. This wasn't simply physical cruelty, it was social destruction. A disfigured woman carried her punishment on her face forever, a living symbol of disobedience. The Ottomans understood that visible scars did more than pain. They erased beauty, diminished marriage prospects, and cemented humiliation. A scarred slave bride could never re-enter society with dignity, and that was the point. The empire had its own hierarchy of punishment. For lesser offenses, speaking out of turn, mocking a master, or defying instructions, the punishment could be swift slaps, confinement, or forced labor. But for repeat defiance, the ladder of punishments climbed quickly. Lashes, bastinado, public shaming, mutilation, and if all else failed, execution. The system wasn't random, it was deliberate, layered, and terrifying in its consistency. One of the more bizarre punishments, especially inside large households, involved forced silence. A slave bride might be gagged for days, fed only through hand signals or small gestures, forbidden from speaking a word. This punishment attacked identity itself. In a world where women were often voiceless in law, stripping them of literal speech drove the point home with cruel precision. Imagine the torment of hearing chatter and laughter around you while your mouth is bound, your words erased. Another punishment used in some households was the yatek sezasa, the bed punishment. A disobedient bride might be tied to a bed frame for hours or days, not to rest but to restrict, her body restrained and her movements controlled. Food and water were rationed, and the humiliation was doubled by the presence of attendants who observed her helplessness. It was a punishment designed not to kill, but to bend the will. Slave brides who attempted to flee the empire entirely faced perhaps the harshest reprisals. Records from provincial courts show that runaway women, if caught, could be paraded with iron collars around their necks. These collars weren't discreet. They were large, heavy, and intentionally humiliating. Some had bells attached, announcing the prisoner's every step. Others had spikes that forced the woman to keep her head in one rigid position. The Ottomans understood symbolism. An iron collar was more than metal. It was the empire's declaration of total ownership. Inside the harem, the politics of punishment grew even darker. Rivalries between concubines sometimes led to accusations of sorcery, poisoning, or plotting against the sultan. Such accusations rarely ended well. A woman labeled as a witch could be drowned, strangled, or simply vanished in the night. The harem, while often imagined as a place of luxury, was in reality a powder keg of suspicion and power struggles, and punishments there were swift and merciless. Yet, beyond the palace walls, everyday households carried their own arsenal of cruelty. One such method was use karasa, or face blackening. Women accused of dishonor or disobedience could have their faces smeared with soot or ashes before being dragged through the streets. The punishment was public, and the humiliation lingered long after the soot washed away. For slave brides, reputation meant survival, and a publicly shamed woman could lose whatever small foothold of respect she had left. But humiliation didn't always stop at parades. Slave brides were sometimes forced into mock marriages as punishment. A woman might be symbolically married to a low-ranking servant, not out of love, but to destroy her status. These mock unions stripped her of any claim to a higher place in the household. Imagine the sting of being paraded in ceremonial clothes, only for the entire event to be a staged degradation. For the Ottomans, stripping dignity was as powerful a punishment as stripping skin. We can't forget the punishments tied to religion. The Ottomans were devout Muslims, and violations of religious codes by slave brides often led to uniquely symbolic punishments. Eating during Ramadan in secret, that could result in forced fasting beyond the required days, sometimes until the woman collapsed from weakness. Disrespect toward religious rituals could lead to being forced to kneel for hours in prayer positions, a punishment that left bodies cramped and aching. These weren't simply corrections, they were ritualized demonstrations of piety enforced through pain. One particularly chilling punishment, recorded in Ottoman chronicles, was drowning in the Golden Horn. For women accused of grave betrayals, sacks were sewn around their bodies, often weighted with stones, before they were thrown silently into the waters of Istanbul. The sack wasn't just practical, it was symbolic. It erased the body, erased the face, and denied the woman the dignity of burial rites. The Ottomans knew that punishment extended beyond life itself, into memory and afterlife, and this method cut all ties at once. And while drowning was used for capital punishment, there was another subtler form of water torture. Some women were subjected to repeated dunking, tied and submerged in water, then pulled out gasping, only to be submerged again. The cycle of suffocation was terrifying, and the public spectacle turned it into theater. Crowds gathered, jeering, watching as a woman's life dangled between air and water. The empire also wielded the whip with merciless precision. Whipping wasn't simply about pain, it was about rhythm, spectacle, and escalation. Ottoman whips were sometimes made of rawhide or even twisted cords designed to tear flesh. A bride accused of lying or disrespect could receive dozens of lashes, her screams echoing through courtyards where others watched in horror. In some provinces, women were whipped on the soles of their feet instead of their backs, a cruel innovation meant to disable without killing. And there were punishments that blurred the line between labor and torture. Slave brides could be forced to grind grain or draw water from wells for endless hours under guard. These tasks weren't meant to be productive, they were meant to exhaust. One recorded punishment involved forcing women to carry heavy jugs of water up and down palace steps repeatedly until their arms gave out. Labor was transformed into slow-motion torture, a way of breaking spirit while cloaking cruelty in routine. But perhaps the punishment that reveals most about Ottoman society was banishment. A disobedient slave bride could be cast out of the palace or household, sent to a remote province, or sold into harsher servitude. On paper, banishment sounds like freedom. In reality, it was a death sentence of another kind. Cast away from the center of power, a woman lost whatever small protection she once had, forced to serve new masters in unfamiliar, often harsher environments. In exile, she carried the stigma of defiance, making her life even more precarious. And then there were punishments that turned the body itself into a stage for cruelty. Slave brides could be forced to wear shackles day and night, not because they were escaping, but because the sound of clinking iron reminded them and everyone else of their status. In some cases, shackles were deliberately oversized, forcing awkward movements and creating constant pain. The punishment was not in the chains themselves, but in the living reminder they imposed. When all else failed, poison was the quiet tool of disposal. Concubines and slave brides who fell into dangerous political entanglements sometimes disappeared after a simple drink of sherbet laced with deadly ingredients. No spectacle, no whip, no cord, just silence. The Ottomans favored control above all, and sometimes the most efficient punishment was the one no one saw. The empire's punishments could also twist into psychological games, though they never would have called it that. A slave bride who angered her master might be forced to serve at banquets while dressed in humiliating costumes, mocked by guests, or made to sing and dance while shackled. The punishment wasn't about labor or pain this time. It was about stripping dignity in front of others. Laughter was turned into a weapon, and humiliation lingered long after the bruises faded. Some punishments targeted the body in more specific, almost surgical ways. Women accused of gossiping or spreading rumors were sometimes punished by having their mouths burned with heated spoons or metal instruments. It was a punishment that matched the crime. If the tongue betrayed, the tongue was made to suffer. The act was symbolic, grotesque, and impossible to forget. And there was the punishment of enforced hunger. Food was power in Ottoman households, and withholding it was a subtle but devastating weapon. Slave brides might be given only scraps, stale bread, or nothing but water for days, weakening their bodies until compliance was the only option. In more extreme cases, women were forced to sit and watch others eat lavish meals while they starved, a slow torture that blended deprivation with psychological cruelty. The Ottomans also used shaving as a punishment. Hair, especially for women, was a symbol of beauty and pride. Shaving a slave bride's head was more than an act of humiliation. It was a declaration that she no longer deserved her femininity. Some women paraded through markets with freshly shaven heads, their humiliation made public before they were returned to servitude. In a world that valued honor and appearance, this simple act cut deeper than many whips. Inside the palaces, punishments could become theatrical events designed for audiences. Slave brides who defied authority could be forced to kneel in the courtyards for entire days under the scorching sun, with guards and attendants walking past them as if they were invisible. Hours turned into days, and fainting was common. But fainting was no escape. The women were doused with cold water and returned to their knees until the punishment was complete. For those who dared to strike back against their masters, punishments turned fatal quickly. An assault, even a slap, could be met with instant execution. But the methods varied. In some provinces, women were buried alive, a punishment carried out in silence with no spectacle. In others, execution was public stoning, hanging, or drowning, turning the woman's final moments into a lesson for the rest of the community. The empire also made use of exile within the palace itself. Slave brides who lost favor with the sultan might be sent to distant chambers, stripped of their attendants and luxuries, living in silence while the world of the harem went on without them. This kind of punishment was called living death because it erased the woman's influence while keeping her technically alive. She was forgotten, her name erased from daily speech, her existence reduced to shadows, and while many punishments were brutal, some were surprisingly creative. One involved forcing women to wear garments smeared with foul substances, parading them through the household in disgrace. Others were forced to drink concoctions made of bitter herbs, oils, or even mild poisons, inducing vomiting and sickness as a form of chastisement. The punishment wasn't designed to kill, only to make the body revolt against itself, leaving the woman shaken and weakened. Slave brides who attempted to resist sexual demands faced punishments that were both cruel and symbolic. In some accounts, women were forced to remain standing naked for hours, while guards or attendants jeered, a degrading display meant to strip all sense of control. Others were confined in chains to their masters' quarters, forced to remain within sight and reach at all times. This constant presence was its own punishment, reducing the woman to little more than a possession on display. One of the darker punishments, reserved for repeat offenders, involved being bound and displayed in public squares overnight. The cold, the stares, the taunts of strangers. It was a punishment designed to make the woman long for the privacy of chains indoors. In cities like Istanbul or Bursa, public humiliation was often as feared as physical torment, because the memory of a crowd's mockery lived far longer than bruises. But perhaps the cruelest punishments came when women were accused of poisoning or plotting against their masters. In those cases, the trials themselves were a form of torment. Slave brides could be interrogated for days, their bodies searched, their meals tested, and their loyalty questioned under the harshest circumstances. Accusations of poisoning almost always ended in death, whether by the silken cord, drowning, or public execution. The accusation itself was often enough. Proof was rarely required. And then there were punishments meant to fracture bonds between women themselves. In the harem, rivalries were fierce, and punishments often played into those divisions. A concubine who fell out of favor might be forced to serve her rival, carrying her clothes, arranging her hair, or preparing her meals. The humiliation of serving a former equal or enemy was as bitter as any lash. It turned personal hatred into another tool of control. One of the more unsettling practices was the use of children as leverage. A slave bride who misbehaved could see her children taken and reassigned to other households, used as bargaining chips, or raised as servants far from their mothers. The punishment targeted the deepest human bond, severing maternal ties to enforce obedience. In an empire where lineage was everything, to lose one's child was a punishment no whip could match. The Ottomans also made use of symbolic punishments. In some cases, a slave bride accused of disobedience might have her fine clothes taken and replaced with rags, her jewelry stripped, her shoes removed. She would be forced to walk barefoot in places where others wore silk. This was punishment through deprivation, turning status into mockery, reminding her and everyone else of her fall from grace. Even exile wasn't always permanent freedom. Some women were sold to harsher households after punishment, condemned to labor in remote provinces, far from the center of power. In these households, punishments could be even more brutal: forced farm work under chains, lashes for slowing down, or confinement in barns like animals. For women used to palace life, this fall was its own kind of torment. And while death was often the final punishment, the methods varied depending on status. Noble concubines received the silk cord, seen as dignified. Others faced drowning, hanging, or beheading. The methods reflected hierarchy even in death. The Ottomans never forgot rank, even while delivering the final blow. But perhaps the most haunting punishments were those that left no visible scars. Slave brides who resisted could be deliberately ignored, their existence unacknowledged by everyone in the household. No orders, no tasks, no conversations. At first this might seem merciful, but the silence was devastating. In a world where identity depended on service and recognition, to be erased was to be nothing. This punishment of absence left women broken in ways no whip could. There were also punishments that blurred the line between cruelty and spectacle. Some slave brides were forced to endure hours of kneeling on coarse salt, gravel, or rice. At first it felt like discomfort, but as time passed, the sharp grains pressed into the skin, cutting and bruising until their knees bled. The act was often carried out in front of others, where the pain was magnified by the humiliation of being watched. Every flinch and grimace a form of entertainment for onlookers. Others were punished by being forced into repetitive, endless motions, carrying buckets of water back and forth until exhaustion, turning millstones with no end in sight, or scrubbing the same section of floor for hours until skin peeled. These punishments seemed mundane, but that was their cruelty. They turned life itself into an instrument of torment, stretching time until every second felt unbearable. In certain cases, punishments were tied directly to Ottoman legal traditions. A slave bride accused of theft could face amputations. Hands, fingers, and sometimes even ears were cut to mark the crime forever. It wasn't always carried out with the full weight of law, but households sometimes borrowed the symbolism, tying a woman's hands tightly with rope until circulation cut off, mimicking the loss of limbs as a warning. Symbol or reality, the meaning was the same. Your body could be changed forever by a single act of disobedience. Some punishments were designed to spread fear beyond the victim. A woman could be tied to the gates of the household overnight, forced to stand or hang in the open air, as every passerby saw her disgrace. Rain, wind, and cold gnawed at her body, while gossip gnawed at her reputation. Even if she survived the punishment itself, she carried the whispers afterward, her shame magnified by the public stage. Inside the harem, discipline sometimes took the form of isolation in strange, symbolic chambers. Some concubines were placed in mirrored rooms, where they faced their own reflections endlessly. Others were confined in small courtyards where birds circled overhead, left exposed to sun and rain. These punishments didn't just break the body, they played with the mind, turning time and space into cages. Slave brides caught trying to communicate secretly with outsiders faced punishments that targeted their words. Letters could be burned in front of them, tongues threatened with knives, or mouths stuffed with cloth soaked in bitter herbs. Each act was a declaration that even though and voice belonged to the master, and that silence was safer than expression. Some punishments crossed into the realm of theater so vividly that they almost seem invented. A woman might be forced to wear chains shaped like jewelry, heavy golden cuffs, or collars that looked elegant but cut into skin with every movement. To the untrained eye, she seemed adorned. To her, it was slow torment disguised as luxury. The Ottomans understood irony, and they weaponized it. And then came punishments rooted in superstition. Women accused of bringing misfortune or illness to a household could be subjected to ritual purifications that doubled as torment. Cold water poured over them in winter, herbs rubbed into open wounds, or smoke from harsh resins forced into their lungs. These rituals were said to drive out evil, but their true purpose was discipline, wrapped in the cloak of belief. Escape attempts always carried the heaviest price. In Istanbul, captured runaways were sometimes paraded across bridges or through markets with signs hung around their necks announcing their failure. Some were forced to wear chains so heavy they left permanent scars across the shoulders. The spectacle made sure no other woman in the crowd would forget what happened to those who tried to flee. And there were punishments that weren't written in any law or code, but lived in the imagination of masters. A bride who broke a priceless vessel might be forced to sift through piles of sand until she found every shard. One who was late in serving could be made to stand at the doorway for entire nights without rest. These punishments were improvised, but their unpredictability made them even more terrifying. Rules you can anticipate, whim you cannot. Even in their final moments, slave brides were not spared spectacle. Executions could be arranged privately, but some were staged before select audiences of nobles or guards. The silken cord, the drowning sack, or even a simple beheading could be transformed into lessons whispered through the palace halls. Death wasn't just an end, it was another instrument of control, ensuring that others remembered and obeyed. And yet in the quiet corners of history, what made these punishments truly powerful was not just their brutality, but their purpose. Each act, from the lash to the sack, from shaved hair to silken cord, was about making the human body and spirit bend to another's will. Punishment wasn't random, it was ritual. It was a system. It was the empire writing its laws, not just in ink but in flesh, bone and silence. The legacy of those punishments lingered far beyond the lives of the women who endured them. Each scar, each story, each whispered memory became part of the invisible machinery that kept the system intact. And for the slave brides caught within it, survival itself became a form of resistance. One step, one breath, one day at a time under the weight of punishments no one outside those walls could fully see.